Hi, I'm Josh, and welcome to my fourth and final quarter reading review of 2020. So this is a part of my series of reviewing my reading statistics over the past quarter. To be clear, this is just of the final quarter of 2020. I will have an entire reading review up after this of the entire year. We take a look at the same statistics, but over the span of the entire year. And I know people probably don't want quarter review, you probably want end of year stuff, but before I can do that, I can't look past my quarter review. It's important to me to look at it on a granular and on a large scale basis. Now, if you've never seen these before, I have a lot of statistics that I talk about. These aren't really about individual books as much as it is about broad scale reading tendencies that I have. Now, I feel like I owe some thank you to Ashley from Bookish Realm and the others who are on her New Year's Eve live show, because all these statistics took me hours to complete, and I did them all while I was watching their New Year's Live, and that, first off, was so much fun. You can check it out. Wait, I'm not sure if you posted it, but it was pretty damn good, and I also finished my yearly review, so it's nice to be caught up on my stats. And also, I'm really excited because this next year is going to be even better, because now that I have a template of all my graphs in place, all I have to do is log in the data that I'm reading, and I won't have to worry about having to make all the figures, which is part of why these usually come in so late. So I'm excited to keep this going and finally be in a place where I can easily give you my statistics without it taking hours of my time to compile. Now, I read 41 books in this semester. Damn it, in this quarter. This is not a bad amount. It is the least amount that I've ever read in a quarter. It composes about 20% of my total reading, but all in all, 40 obviously is good. If I were to read 40 every quarter, 40 times 4 is 160. My goal next year is to read 150 books. So I'm actually completely fine with my current pace of reading of this last quarter. It's actually much closer to what I'm aiming for than when I had been in the early parts of the year, where I was basically pushing myself to the absolute limit. I want a nice balance. Reading, personal life, and of course, just YouTube itself. Looking at the most interesting statistic, I think, which is by genre. And what we see here is a huge amount of nonfiction. And that is, of course, thanks to Nonfiction November. I have these split up into color-coded. We have nonfiction being generally shades of orange. We have green, which is generally going to be historical, classical, contemporary. And then we have fantasy and sci-fi in the purple and blue category. And of course, horror and would-be mystery thriller in red, shades of red. I did not read any mystery thriller, I think because I was gravitating towards horror. I'm surprised that nonfiction has dominated half of what I read. Now, granted, I did read a lot in November, but even then, it's like, that's 1 month of 3. So why it ended up being that way, I'm not quite sure. The highest here would, of course, be history and politics, which makes sense. I love history and politics. It was also the election, so it got me really politically inclined with my reading. Next, followed up by horror, and then classics. Now, what I will say here is that a lot of my classics were either in the category of horror, thriller, and even some of them were in sci-fi fantasy. But if something is classic, I will always let that sort of trump all the other subcategories. Partly because I need to read more classics and that works for me. Is that kind of cheating? Maybe, but I don't care. It's my rules. Some example of classics that I read might have been like, Dracula, Frankenstein, Rebecca, East of Eden. There's a lot that can be encapsulated by classic. What I do like about this was my goal was to read 12, at least 12 last year. This year, whatever you want to call this, and 7 out of 12. I assure you, I'm pretty sure I read at least 5 before now, which it works out because there were a few months there I wasn't reading any at all. I'm happy that I'm finding classics that work for me. I ended up reading a lot of science in this last few months, which is a little bit surprising because I had noticed earlier in this year that I hadn't been reading as much. That's about all I can say about the genres. Before we look at the diversity of what I'm reading, let's take a look at the actual pages and other stuff about it. So we have the page numbers, which we can see here. It's generally about the same. I don't know what the average is. It's probably around 300 to 400 pages. I did read a good amount of bigger books, I think, about what I want here. And then comparing that to the year they were published, I had a lot of books that were published before 2000. And I'm actually very happy with this. I think in the past I've been focusing too much on newer books, and I like that a lot of my books are getting older. I want to make sure I'm reading plenty of backlist, including older backlist. The takeaway, it seems, of this fourth quarter review is that I'm finally reaching my peak of finding and doing what it is I want to achieve in what I'm reading, at least so far. Next up, looking at the fourth quarter ratings, what we can see here is that I think we actually have a pretty good splice of stuff. No 1 star, because I struggle with 1 star. I mean, usually I wouldn't finish it. I barely finish 2 stars. But we have a good amount of 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, and the highest is 5 star. That's fine. I mean, clearly it shows that I am not afraid to give lower ratings, but I also have plenty of solid 5-star ratings that I was able to achieve this year, this quarter. Now looking at the diversity of what I'm reading. Listen, this graphing shit is hard, so I have to make some corrections because I've edited this now and I've started uploading it and I rewatched it again and I realized my numbers do not make sense. I read 41 books, yet some of my graphs are adding to way above that, so I need to retrofit this and take a step back in some of these areas. Let's start here and look at ethnicity. My ethnicity is about on par with previous months or quarters, to about a third of what I've been reading. I clearly have room to improve here, especially on, I guess, reading more of these underrepresented groups. I think my goal for the next year is to try and push this number from 1/3 to 1/2. And how I get there, I haven't exactly figured out, but I think these graphs help. And within that, I want a diversity of ethnicities, not just Black authors, but Indigenous, Asian, which it means South Asian, West Asian, mainland Asian, or East Asian, Pacific Islanders there, as well as Latinx and others that may not be shown here. What I like about this is that I want to be clear, I'm not just like thinking every month, like, oh, I need this, this, and this, and this. What I like about these quarter reviews is that it gives me a chance to reflect on the past quarter and previous quarters before that and say, how diverse is my range of authors that I'm reading? And are there any ethnicities that I am somehow missing? In which case, I can be aware of that in the coming months and then make a point to preferentially pick up books by ethnicities that are underrepresented in what I'm reading, which is why I'm a big advocate of these sort of stats, especially these quarterly stat reviews. It's a good way, I think, of keeping track of how diverse your reading is without having to strictly, just plan exactly what it is you're reading to fit like every quota every month. So again, we're still on track for this quarter being a representative of me getting closer to achieving that which is my goal. Yeah, scratch that. I'm not on track in all areas like I thought I was. Now take a look at gender. My range of cis male to cis female has gotten better in the sense that I was at like 2/3 women and 1/3 men for the majority of the year. So I guess that's some progress, but it's not really progress I care much about. I don't really mind having less men than women. I do care that I'm only read one non-binary author. At the very least I can do is to read a non-binary or trans author at least once a month, which is something I'm aware of moving forward in the new year. But I want to improve this number better than that. I want it to be a larger fraction. And the reason I've actually combined non-binary and trans authors here is because of the fact that they're so underrepresented in what I'm reading. So again, this is an area that I clearly have room to improve on. I think it's one of the biggest areas I need to improve on. Comparing that to Queer Rep, not even a quarter here. This isn't the best quarter for Queer Rep. If you're curious what I mean by Queer Rep, that's going to be a queer author and or queer protagonist is usually what I would label it as. There are some exceptions to that because I'm a little bit unsure how to identify Queer Rep because I don't quite think just having an author who is queer writing a book is enough to be considered Queer Rep. If there's nothing about the story that I think is going to be embodying their queerness. So I'm still struggling here exactly on how to quantify this number, but to the first order, let's just say this is a good enough representation of the queerness that I'm reading. Can still do better. That's what matters here. So now let's look at the final bit, which is going to be how I'm getting my books, where I'm getting my book. And let's start with just this sort of pie chart. We're looking at books that I reread, books that are ARCs or borrowed. Usually it's like, I'm listening to the book from Audible or Scribd without owning a physical book. And then of course from my TBR. In past quarters, I split the from TBR shelf into like my TBR before 2020 and then books I bought in 2020, but I have a better way of visualizing that, which we'll get to in a second. But all in all, I am clearly getting books from my TBR shelf, but take this pie chart with a grain of salt because a lot of the books from my TBR shelf are bought in the last year or two, meaning they're basically brand new books that I bought and then read. So this graph maybe isn't as helpful as I would like it to be, but it definitely seems to imply that I'm reading from my TBR shelf, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. but it also doesn't really mean much at all, considering how I'm basically gaming the system here. But we'll do more with that information in a second. First, let's look at this split up between the months. Not much to see here except for the fact that in December, I made a point to address some arcs. I actually wanted to read more arcs in December, but I ended up not getting to them because my reading month wasn't as successful as I had hoped for. But one thing I am paying a lot of attention to is I'm basically outlining all of my arcs and trying to think of a way to tackle these, because it is, I think, a disservice to the publisher, to the authors, and to myself to request these and then not review them. So even if they're a backlog, these are things that I'm making a point to address. And hopefully these numbers will look better in the next year. And lastly, let's take a look at this graph, which I think is a better representation of how well I'm tackling my TBR shelf than that pie chart which I showed you. Now what you see here is essentially the age of the book on the x-axis and then the relative number of books on the y-axis. Now I have normalized this, which that means it just means that think of it as sort of percentage of the whole. So my TBR shelf is a lot bigger than my books that I read. So if I were to show you just like a graph of both, you would just see a big blue graph and a very tiny little red, you would make sense of it. What I'm doing here is just to give you an idea of, relative to what I already own, what fraction of what I'm reading is this age. And the takeaway here is that in general, I'm reading more newer books that are newer to me, which is not necessarily a bad thing considering most of the books I own are newer. And relatively speaking, I am still reading a few books that are older, meaning these little red graphs that are in the higher ages. That means I'm probably reading 1 or 2 books that are in that category of books that I've owned for that long. And I think that is okay, because if I continue to follow this trend, I should slowly start to decay those older books, even if there are a lot more of those than what I'm reading every month. The goal is to stay in line with what I own. As long as I'm doing that, I think it's okay. Part of the reason I have continued to normalize these numbers is because if you saw the actual number of my TBR, it would basically show you the number of books that I've bought in the last year or two, and I'm embarrassed by that, so I'm not going to show you. I've given you a number of my total in past videos. You can figure it out from there if you'd like, but yeah, I'm not going to do the work for you. But that's the gist of it. So basically what you would expect. The age of the books that I'm reading reflect the age of the books that are on my TBR. I'm not exclusively reading newer books, although obviously I read a lot more of those because a lot more books that I own aren't by definition newer. So that wraps up this quarter review, the last review of the year. And all in all, I think this was actually a pretty good quarter. Even though I've read the least amount of books that I have all year, I've gotten closer to achieving the goals that I've been aiming for throughout the entire year. And again, yeah, no, I mean, sure, in some areas I'm doing pretty good, but others, it's not as great as I thought it was. Check your graphs, Josh. Jesus Christ. Do I have areas to improve? Sure. Is it going to take work to maintain where I'm at so far? Obviously. But all of this is happening largely because of these wonderful, delightful quarterly wrap-ups. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you do any way of tracking what you're reading, if you follow your stats, if you make videos about it. Obviously, let me know about that too, because I love watching stat videos. But as always, hope you stay safe. And until next time, goodbye.